Thank you, everybody, for joining us. My name is Catherine Hulls. I'm one of the co-founders and one of the coordinators of the Jewish Muslim Research Network. I'm also a PhD student in history at the CUNY Graduate Centre and a translator of Arabic literature. And I will be introducing our speaker today. And I'm also joined by Flora Hastings, who's another coordinator of the network, who will be doing a Q&A later. We're very excited about today's event. Before I get onto that, I'll just quickly tell you that we have another event 2 weeks today, which promises to be very interesting. It's a launch of a new book called The Arab-Jewish Questions, Geographies of Engagement in Palestine and Beyond. And we'll be talking to the editors of that book, Leila Farsakh and Bashir Bashir, and they'll be in conversation with one of the contributors, Moshe Bahar, as well as Nadia Fadel. And yeah, for more information about that event and all of our others, we've still got, I think, 2 or 3 more before the end of the semester. You can go to our website and you can also join our mailing list, which Flora has just put in the chat. We're really excited about today's event. It was meant to take place this time last year, more or less. It was supposed to be the keynote speech at the JMRN conference, which sadly didn't happen because of COVID. And that was before we'd, got used to doing all of this stuff online. So we're really happy that it's finally happening. Our speaker is Seth Anziska, who is the Mohammed S. Farsi Polonsky Associate Professor of Jewish Muslim Relations at University College London. His research and teaching focuses on Israeli and Palestinian society and culture, modern Middle Eastern history, and contemporary Arab and Jewish politics. He's the author of Preventing Palestine, A Political History from Camp David to Oslo, which came out in 2018, and which was awarded the British Association for Jewish Studies Book Prize in 2019. His writing has appeared in the New York Times and the New York Review of Books, and he's currently working on an international history of the 1982 Lebanon War, supported by the British Academy and the Leverhulme Trust. He's going to be talking to us today about a very timely topic, defining anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, lessons from UK universities. He'll be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll be opening up to Q&A. The chat function is going to be switched off during the talk, but we'll switch it back on when Seth comes to a close, and you'll be able to either type your questions into the chat if you'd like, or if you'd like to speak them, just write in the chat that you have a question, and Flora will hand over to you and unmute you so that you can deliver your question yourself. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Seth Anziska.
Well, many thanks, Catherine, for the very kind introduction. And I'm really delighted to join all of you today, especially at the invitation of Dr. Adi Baharat and the Jewish Muslim Relations Network, which I've been very fortunate to be a part of in the UK, and which I think has expanded its membership and activities globally in really exciting directions in the very short time since it was formed. And the interest, I think, that it has generated and the scholarly as well as collegial need that it fills speaks to the vitality of research and public engagement in the field of Jewish-Muslim relations. This lecture grows out of my involvement over the last 2 years in a series of interlinked events, both at UCL and beyond, that are tied to pressing questions about the politics of definitions of racism and prejudice, primarily focused on anti-Semitism, but also involving Islamophobia. And as a historian of the modern Middle East, focusing both on Israel-Palestine and on Jewish-Muslim relations, I found the questions that were emerging in the specific context of UK universities helpful, I think, in our broader thinking about the imbrication of national and communal identities with the lived experience of discrimination on religious and ethnic grounds and the critical implications that follow from this linkage. So this lecture is really a first attempt to start disentangling some of the dynamics that I've witnessed around calls for the adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or the IHRA, working definition of anti-Semitism, as well as the All-Party Parliamentary Group, the APPG, on Islamophobia, which have shaped fierce debates on university campuses in the UK, and I think as well in the United States. Why have group-specific definitions of anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim prejudice taken on such urgency in recent years? How have they been linked together, and can they help resolve patterns of prejudice? And to what extent do definitions such as these two collapse distinctions between religious animus and legitimate political speech? What is this conjunctural moment really about? And how might we productively reflect on the possibilities and limitations that these definitions and the debates around them pose? And while I'm only going to be able to touch on some of these questions, I hope we can expand on them together in the Q&A and think a little bit more about further avenues for discussion and inquiry. But let me begin with an incident that transpired at my own university and brought me directly into this conversation about definitions. In February of 2019, an exhibit titled Moving Objects, Stories of Displacement opened at UCL's Octagon Gallery, which is a central art exhibit space at the university. It was curated jointly by several academics at UCL, exploring the relationship between and journeys of objects, humans, and animals in exile, and tracing what it means to be displaced. And this is taken from the text of the exhibit. The exhibition draws together material objects, poems, visual pieces, and archival material selected, co-created, and analyzed by people with refugee backgrounds. Many of the materials emerged through object handling, craft, writing, and photography workshops in cities and camps, including in Beirut and the Badawi refugee camp in the north, in Tripoli in Lebanon, in London, and in Jerash, Talbiya camp and Zarqa camp in Jordan. The exhibition built upon interdisciplinary, collaborative, and participatory research, working with communities who experience and respond to displacement. And in a series of vitrines in the gallery, several different kinds of objects were co-curated with refugees and academics about the experience of forced migration from those living in these refugee camps, as well as in London. And this included Syrian refugees, Palestinian refugees, and among the objects on display were several items from communities of Palestinian refugees in Jordan, including an embroidered Tatriz map of historic Palestine. This is traditional Palestinian embroidery technique. And this map of this embroidery as an object taken from this refugee camp reflected a Palestinian longing for home from the vantage point of the displaced, and included a Palestinian flag and did not make any reference to Israel. In July of 2019, one of the curators of the exhibition received an email from a summer student at UCL who was deeply unhappy with the display on political grounds. And this was soon framed as a complaint about, quote, hidden anti-Semitism in the exhibit, lodged via the official complaints procedure of the university. Unsatisfied with the initial response, the student alerted external activists. And in August of 2019, a petition appeared online entitled Correct the Anti-Israel Propaganda in UCL's Refugees Exhibition. It was signed by over 700 people, contending that the Moving Objects exhibit was full of anti-Israel propaganda, pointing primarily, quote, to a map of Israel with a Palestinian flag on top and all signs of Jewish habitation erased. In an online discussion of the exhibit, the organizer of this petition publicly attacked one of the curators and criticized the university for promoting, quote, anti-Israel propaganda in the guise of an exhibition to publicize issues around refugees, adding the phrase, UCL donors, please note. The petition and this criticism reached the highest levels of the university administration, and in response, led to a decision to begin some form of an investigation into this accusation. And in this experience, or in the response to the decision to start an investigation, the organizer of the petition responded online that this was not enough. Nearly 700 have signed the petition. Please confirm that all the Palestinian flags are removed from the exhibits. And UCL did in fact launch a review, which I was asked to participate in, along with several other leading experts of Jewish history, Palestinian history, Israeli history, anti-Semitism, and related fields, some of whom might actually be on this lecture. and we viewed the exhibition and found no basis to the claim that it should be taken down on the grounds of anti-Semitism, or that it was inappropriate in other ways. An initial effort to place an explanatory text alongside the exhibition was also rejected, which was seen as damaging the integrity of the work, mistakenly questioning the scholarship behind it, and raising more concerns about a possible threat to academic freedom. Despite the university's ultimate defense of the exhibition and the decision not to include this text, the accusation of hidden anti-Semitism smeared the integrity of colleagues and failed to distinguish between challenging or uncomfortable forms of knowledge production that may come into conflict with deeply held beliefs of a student or member of the public. In gathering information about the exhibit and questioning curatorial decisions of UCL academics, the review process lent credence, perhaps inadvertently, to defamatory accusations of anti-Semitic bias against those academics for presenting perspectives and objects by relevant interviewees that criticized or sidelined Israeli or Zionist narratives. And the approach conflated the representation of challenging perspectives with prejudicial or discriminatory behavior, going far beyond definitions of discrimination and harassment contained in UK law or in UCL's written policies, and in so doing, degrading the research of academic scholars and stifling legitimate debate. Now, this pattern of invoking anti-Semitism as a way of shutting down representations of the Palestinian lived experience reminded me a great deal of things I saw in the US over 15 years ago in the early 2000s as an undergraduate at Columbia University, where some of the first battles over the politics of anti-Semitism and debates over Israel and Palestine became so inextricably linked. As many of you will no doubt recall, the intersection of campus debates, sensationalist press accounts in New York, and the linking of local dynamics with regional politics created a toxic environment which began to shape tenure battles, classroom monitoring, and the growing strength of advocacy organizations within university settings. Nearly 2 decades later, there seems to be a recurrence of this pattern, albeit under the guise of a struggle over the adoption of an IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, and the UK government's insistence that the adoption of this text be completed before Christmas of 2020. And this was the decision rendered by Gavin Williamson, the representative for higher education. And I'm going to come back to the meaning of the moving objects exhibit in this particular context, but I think what transpired should serve as a clear indication of how closely intertwined the politics of definitions are with these broader political debates, and that we cannot examine them in a vacuum without consideration of the unhelpful ways in which anti-Semitism has implicated Palestinians and speech on Palestine. But before I turn to the IHRA as well as the APPG, I do want to also take some time to talk about the very real lived experience of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and what tools exist in a university setting to respond effectively. And in my own institution, which has a very proud history of pluralism, those of you who know much about University College London will know that it was the first university established in England that was not limited to members of the church and was open to Jews and non-believers. And in this context, the fact that there have been incidents of anti-Semitism is obviously a very troubling reality that we have to contend with, and I think mirrors the presence of anti-Jewish prejudice in wider British society, as well as the persistence of anti-Semitism globally as a feature of modern life. And in some ways, this is unsurprising. It follows patterns we'd see in the US, although I think the rise of anti-Jewish threats from the right and from white nationalists, like the growth of right-wing hate groups in Europe, also suggests a kind of flaw in positing a left-right continuum in thinking about sources of anti-Semitism, as the primary source of this antagonism in most recent years is firmly happening on the right. Many of the cases that have been recorded in the context of my own institution reflect the persistence of deep-seated anti-Semitic tropes as a feature of social interactions. In 2016, Dr. Kathy Elliott a senior teaching fellow in our Department of Political Science, undertook some examination of this experience of anti-Semitism. And when the interviewees discussed the experiences that they had had, much of it and much of what they described, as Kathy explained, had nothing explicitly to do with conversations about Israel or Palestine, but much of this anti-Semitism that students narrated was not old poison in new bottles. The bottles were old too. As she explains, we came across many students who were afraid of disclosing that they were Jewish because of experiences of being called names or having to listen to jokes about Nazis, anti-Semitic tropes about rich Jews or stingy Jews, or Jews controlling the media or the supermarkets or the world, or having to endure judgments about whether or not they, quote, looked Jewish, jokes about the Holocaust, patronizing explanations of the Holocaust from non-Jews, crass comparisons between the Holocaust and unrelated issues such as animal rights, as well as doubts about the Holocaust's importance, where in one case signaled by the question, what do you think about the Holocaust? The student on the receiving end had had family members murdered by the Nazis. This was a clear pattern of ugly attitudes and behavior just under the surface of campus life. It implies a surprising lack of literacy in the old tropes and conspiracy theories of anti-Semitism, Elliott explained, and of empathy towards Jewish students, particularly when discussing the Holocaust. UCL's Jewish Society conducted its own online survey of 78 students in January 2019 that found nearly 72% reported that they had experienced anti-Semitism on campus. From their report, comments reported by students covered a wide range of classic anti-Semitic tropes, including appearance, you've got a small nose for a Jew, money, quotes like, why don't you pay for my Uber, Jew boy? You don't need an internship, you're guaranteed a job in a bank. I'm not surprised, your people are so good with money, said by a supervisor to their PhD student when he mentioned he had identified a source of funding, as well as tropes about power, about the media, and some instances of strong feelings related to Israel-Palestine that affected Jewish students on campus, regardless of their view on or connection with Israel, with reported comments including, why do you like killing children? And you're Jewish, so you take all the water from Gaza. Most recently, or more recently, I should say, UCL's Islamic Society has undertaken a survey of their own of students and staff to describe experiences of Islamophobia. The responses have revealed that the problem is more extensive than members had realized, with only 13% of Muslim students polled feeling comfortable reporting anti-Muslim harassment. These very troubling examples are acutely disturbing and raise fundamental questions about existing institutional avenues for reporting either anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. And it is in this context that leaders of the Jewish Society felt necessary to advocate for more specific language identifying anti-Semitism, and therefore advocated for the adoption of the IHRA working definition on anti-Semitism, which I'll get to in a moment. A parallel discussion shaped the decision within the Islamic Society to consider definitions of Islamophobia. Ultimately, the Islamic Society opted to delay any adoption of a definition pending further examination. Now, definitions aside, this underreporting of racism is a wider problem across the higher education sector in the UK, as I'm sure it will probably be the case in the United States, despite existing legal structures in place to deal with racial and religious hatred, as well as discrimination and harassment. And I won't go into the details, but in the UK context, there's a very robust public order of 1986 that prohibits intentionally stirring up racial hatred, which was amended by a Racial and Religious Hatred Act of 2006. And there's a very robust 2010 Equality Act, which protects groups defined by certain protected characteristics from discrimination, harassment, and victimization. And that includes age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage, civil partnership, race, religion, etc. Relevant to the question of anti-Semitism is both race, which is defined to include color, nationality, and ethnic or national origins, and religion or belief, including lack of belief. And so in this context of existing structures of UK equality law, there still is this rising interest in group-specific definitions of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And so I want to explore a little bit about what these definitions are and what the consideration around them might suggest. So let me begin with the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. The text of what is now referred to as the IHRA working definition originated as a non-legally binding working definition drafted by a group of academics and others at the request of the Vienna-based EU agency for European Monitoring, the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia, the EUMC. And the working definition was removed from the EUMC website in 2013, later presented in 2016 in a press release by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, an organization founded in 1998 with 31 member states. The background to the adoption of this definition by the EUMC includes a documented rise in anti-Semitic incidents across Europe in the 1990s and the early 2000s. According to Kenneth Stern, one of the drafters of the definition, it was created, quote, as a tool for data collectors in European countries to identify what to include and exclude from their reports about anti-Semitism, and to have a common frame of reference so that the data might be compared across borders. So it was an effort to figure out how we could monitor, in Stern's view, the actual reality of data of anti-Semitic incidents, which hadn't existed before. Now, it might be worth noting, I think, as Stern emphasized, the task of identifying instances of events that might be collected and counted for the gathering of statistics, which is the designated purpose of the EUMC or the IHRA definition, is not the same task as adjudicating on a specific instance itself. So a complaint of harassment against a student or a staff member or visitor at a university would require a burden of proof at least as high as the civil standard of a balance of probabilities, or in some cases even higher. No such burden of proof applies to the gathering of statistics of probable or possible incidents of anti-Semitism. So already you can see there is a distinction between a practitioner's guide, practitioner's use of a definition for the purpose of data gathering, and the deployment of definitions in settings like university. One other motivation for the EUMC definition was increasing concern about the new anti-Semitism, a highly debated concept first coined by academics in the 1960s and 1970s, and defined by Irwin Cutler, Canadian professor of law, as follows. In a word, classical anti-Semitism is discrimination against, denial of, or assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members of whatever society they inhabit. The new anti-Semitism involves the discrimination against, denial of, or assault upon the right of the Jewish people to live as an equal member of the family of nations, with Israel as the targeted collective Jew among the nations. This concern of the new anti-Semitism underlines some of the examples of anti-Semitism included in the IHRA working definition, specifically focused on Israel. At the end of 2020, more than 30 countries have adopted the IHRA working definition, including the UK government under Prime Minister Theresa May in December of 2016, as well as by over 100 local authorities and dozens of universities. And this included UCL's decision to adopt it in November of 2019 as part of a framework for promoting race equality and tackling discrimination at UCL. And I won't go into so much more detail about the IHRA, but the non-legally binding working definition, of which is the core part of it, reads as follows. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. For an example to qualify as anti-Semitic under the IHRA definition, it must fit this underlying text of a certain perception of Jews when taking into account the overall context. And this could include, as the definition goes on, making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews as such, or the power of Jews as collective, such as, especially but not exclusively, the myth about a world Jewish conspiracy or of Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other societal institutions. On the other hand, it is a matter for debate whether some of the other examples from the IHRA working definition are always and unequivocally constitutive of anti-Semitism and therefore fit for purpose, especially when it comes to speech about Israel and Palestine. The difficulty arises because the definition, through the use of its appended 11 examples, specifies that anti-Semitism may include, quote, the targeting of the state of Israel conceived as a Jewish collectivity. Although the definition states this is not meant to include criticism of Israel, similar to that leveled against another country, it would include denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g. by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. This example raises free speech concerns because it may prevent speakers, academics, or students from speaking out or voicing concerns about Zionism as an ideology and connectedly the legitimacy of the state of Israel and its legal framework. And to deal with this concern, many organizations included two caveats in their adoption of the IHRA recommended by the Home Affairs Select Committee in 2016. Those are, first, that it is not anti-Semitic to criticize the government of Israel without additional evidence to suggest anti-Semitic intent. And secondly, that it is not anti-Semitic to hold the Israeli government to the same standards as other liberal democracies, or to take a particular interest in the Israeli government's policies or actions without additional evidence to suggest anti-Semitic intent. Now, do these caveats go far enough to protect the freedom of speech for those who seek to criticize Israel or Zionism without anti-Semitic intent? The IHRA working definition and its examples, while starting by reference to a certain perception of Jews, otherwise make no reference to the intent of the speaker. Certain ideas are declared anti-Semitic, but intent does not play a role. The Parliamentary Select Committee caveats, by contrast, place intent front and center. So the first challenge is how to figure out or interpret this awkward combination. And what are the likely effects in practice? Because of the fundamental ambiguity around the meaning of the IHRA definition with caveats, there is a profound lack of clarity about which ideas are stigmatized and which are not, creating a risk that the adoption of this definition, even with its caveats, can have a chilling effect on criticism of Israel or lead to risk-averse behavior on the part of either individuals or institutions, and a danger that enforcing certain policies can creep inappropriately toward the silencing or policing of knowledge production. And there is ample evidence of how this chilling effect has functioned on US and UK university campuses in the wake of the IHRA adoption, including warnings by Ken Stern, as he's written quite extensively, or you can look into the very extensive and careful work of the NGO Palestine Legal, which has documented cases of particular abuse. Now, does the IHRA adoption mean that scholars or students will feel inhibited for fear of disciplinary consequence from speaking critically about Israel or Israeli policies? Does it mean that institutions will be less likely to host events involving speakers on these topics? What are the implications for teaching? Will lecturers have to reconsider how they might teach difficult topics such as the 1948 war and probe the links between Israeli independence and Palestinian dispossession? How might the IHRA, for example, had it been adopted at the time of the moving objects exhibit, how might it have shaped UCL's inquiry into the complaint of hidden anti-Semitism? Think for a moment about advocates who have called for a right of return of Palestinian refugees and the reconstitution of the Israeli state as a democratic, binational state with equal rights for Jewish and non-Jewish citizens. The new anti-Semitism discourse in this context is not without its critics, but by its metric is showing a Palestinian artifact that does not also portray Israel conjure the accusation of anti-Semitism. Now, for advocates of the IHRA, Adoption of this working definition would make it easier to understand what anti-Semitism is, how it functions, how to report it, and thereby how to identify those in breach for disciplinary sanction. But are advocates of the IHRA paying close attention to its potential for misuse, as well as the mounting evidence of places where it has been abused? And in this, we should think about the prescriptive nature of an adoption and its quasi-legal implementation. We can think, for example, in London, in Tower Hamlets, where a bike ride, a charity bike ride for Gaza, initially organized by Palestinian civil society, was shut down on the grounds that there was a fear it would fall afoul of the IHRA working definition. And this was an example of a kind of instigated self-censorship, not of the IHRA actually being used. And I think this distinction is also important to put out there, is a constant flow of critiques will show us an example where the IHRA has been misused. Part of what is happening here is acts of self-censorship that are actually preempting the invocation of the definition. So in this instance, I also want to stress that I think we need to separate out the intention of the drafters of the IHRA from the use of the working definition itself. And there we can highlight a gap between practitioners and those of us in the classroom who work with students from across communities affected by these questions. But more importantly, how does this adoption of a working definition actually help adjudicate instances of anti-Semitism, or as I'll explain in a moment in the case of the APPG, Islamophobia, that are already happening with an institution? Do they in some way shift the focus away from institutional responsibility? What was disturbing about the incidence of anti-Semitic harassment that I mentioned in the 2016 study of Kathy Elliott or the 2019 Jewish Society survey is how these clear examples of legally actionable manifestations of anti-Semitism went unreported or unaddressed, despite robust legal context and clear policies and procedures to combat these incidents. So by pursuing adoption of definitions, universities are in some ways absolving themselves from the responsibility to enforce existing policies and procedures, while simultaneously failing to safeguard academic freedom, a failure in both directions to maintain a delicate balance between protection of freedom of discussion and the right to work and think in a safe environment that does not countenance harm to various groups and individuals. Let me just briefly say something about the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims and the definition of Islamophobia. And in this, the APPG definition reads as follows: Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. While time is limited, I won't be able to get into a very rich discussion about parallel concerns over a government-led definition on Islamophobia, but I can recommend in particular the work of the scholar Rebecca Ruth Gould, whose article on the limits of liberal inclusivity, how defining Islamophobia normalizes anti-Muslim racism, raises several questions about the pursuit of such a definition. As Gould writes, the tensions that have emerged in connection with the IHRA are likely to appear in connection with any group-specific definition of racism. Such definitions are useful only when they address the systematic structures and social norms within which bigotry is normalized. In addition, as the scholars Lina Salema and Shai Lavi have argued recently, secularism, as embodied by the legal mechanisms of the state, has in fact, in their words, propagated Judeophobia and Islamophobia by delineating a category of religion that is incongruent with Jewish and Islamic traditions, raising deeper concerns about the patterns of comparison and linkages between these two categories. It should be noted that at the same time that the IHRA was adopted in my own institution with the vocal support of the Jewish Society and many others at UCL, the Islamic Society deferred the adoption of the APPG definition, hoping to find something better suited to the lived experience of the community that they represented, not one that was overly reliant on references to race and that would be more suited to protecting religious practices. This, I think, speaks to some of the tensions that the definitions and the debate over their adoption have raised. And in assessing the prevalence of Islamophobia, any university would need to attend to the needs of practicing as well as non-practicing Muslims and consider how these may differ, especially given the focus in the APPG on the former. Like Jewish staff and students, not all those who identify as Muslims are necessarily religious or practicing, but may identify along cultural or ethnic lines or have to contend with discrimination based on name or perception, having nothing to do with religion. All of this points to the very real limits of definitions in dealing with prejudicial behavior, raising the question of whether group-specific definitions of racism and prejudice are even desirable. Given that UK law and university policies already provide reasonable, precise definitions of discrimination, harassment, and victimization, and that the protections against these behaviors apply without limitations to groups defined by religion or ethnicity, what are the advantages and disadvantages of supplementing these general definitions with group-specific details? The answers to these questions might very well differ from group to group, depending, for instance, on the current level of community understanding about a specific type of prejudice. This is the role of an educational tool, right? Some communities where there's knowledge about particular protected characteristics might feel less inclined to have a group-specific definition, whereas others might feel more inclined. On the other hand, if it is decided that some groups receive group-specific definitions and others do not, it raises unavoidable issues of fairness and consistency. And it also raises a question about our turn to legal instruments as a measure of mediating communal interactions or campus life. A focus on educating our communities about how group prejudice functions and where to distinguish discriminatory behavior and legitimate debate over political questions might in fact be more useful than the introduction of definitions. Now, of course, this is much harder to sustain and to confront. And so in this way, definitions become an easy fix, the bureaucratic solution to what takes often deep and sustained educational work and understanding of diverse communities and multiple ways of experiencing marginalization. And in this respect, in my own experience in the UK, the Ihra has become divisive and highlights the gap between governments, practitioners, and monitoring agencies on the one hand, and the lived experience of educators and students on a university campus on the other. There is also no clear evidence yet, certainly, to show that the adoption of a definition works. Certainly not the Ihra, although there are many examples of performative adoptions, and we see this from Tottenham Hotspurs and Arsenal to local councils. It does not guarantee that anti-Semitism will be tackled in substantive terms, nor for that matter, if we were to talk about Islamophobia or anti-Palestinian racism. Definitions can shift responsibility by a university organization to foster inclusive environments into the legal realm, such as a disciplinary process against hate speech, which in some ways creates a reductive approach, framing racism as an individual action or trait rather than a systematic issue. By exempting institutional racism, symbolic adoptions arguably make it harder, not easier, to challenge institutional failings on racism and prejudice for Jews, Muslims, or any protected group. Rather, what I'd suggest is a need to think a little bit about the difficult spaces where discrimination functions, such as the examples of anti-Semitism I mentioned earlier, and likewise when it comes to Islamophobia, given the way in which their appearance is often connected and is charted in similar terms, as also woefully unreported. The scale of the problem of racial harassment, for example, and its prevalence across UK higher education was recently outlined by Universities UK in their November 2020 report on tackling racial harassment in higher ed. Almost a quarter of students from minority ethnic backgrounds reported experiencing racial harassment. Over half of staff who had experienced racial harassment described incidents of being ignored or excluded because of their race, and nearly a third had experienced racist name-calling, insults, and jokes. Staff and students reported regular experience of microaggressions, subtle or less overt forms of racism, and racial harassment occurred in a wide variety of settings and from multiple harassers. This is all to quote from the UUK report. None of this will likely surprise any of us paying attention to the lived experience of racism, whether it's in the UK or in the US, although those of you who have seen the story of the UK government's report on racism and its appalling failure to account for structural racism might think that the UK government has a bit of a different view. But a host of scholars from critical race studies and related fields have carefully charted these dynamics and their genealogy. So given this context and the reality of these structural developments and the existence of these forms of discrimination, what is this debate over definitions of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia really about? And here I want to think a little bit about some of the scholarship on anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim hatred that's produced over decades, and our current focus on one or another particular iteration. All of us, I'm sure many of us with bookshelves behind us, could pull 20 or 30 books off of our shelves on these respective topics, if not 70 or 80, given the robust debates in these fields. Those of us who have been studying questions around anti-Semitism might find also, of course, those who would argue that we should move away from a definition like David Engel, to a host of other perspectives and views on this question. And given the rich amount of scholarship that has been produced on this topic, we somehow find ourselves stuck in this terrain of symbolic politics, obsessed with finding one definition in particular and what this adoption or lack of an adoption of a definition signifies about the boundaries of communal belonging. The Ihra in this way has become a totem. Being for or against it has become aligned with caring or not caring about anti-Semitism, or worse. Critics of the Ihra have been portrayed as, quote, abetting anti-Semitism. And here I could specifically mention my colleague, Professor David Feldman at Birkbeck, whose critique of the Ihra in The Guardian elicited the accusation along those lines, as well as the removal of the name and funding of the Pears Foundation from his Institute of the Study of Anti-Semitism at Birkbeck. This is the kind of atmosphere that we are now confronting. The same concern arises with definitions of Islamophobia and the delimiting of communal boundaries when it comes to the involvement of the state. As Rebecca Gould argues, and to quote her directly, any definition of Islamophobia presupposes a definition of Islam. While believers may define these concepts in ways that make the most sense to them, the moment the state becomes involved in mandating or even preferring certain definitions over others is the moment when a government-backed definition of Islamophobia begins to pose a threat not only to free speech, but also to freedom for Muslims within that state to define themselves as they choose. Such maneuverings limit the autonomy of individual Muslims, particularly in Muslim minority societies such as the United Kingdom, to define Islam for themselves and on their own terms. They also compel such individuals to align with specific Muslim groups and specific versions of Islam. These tensions within definitions of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia suggest much deeper concerns that are at the heart of scholarly work in Jewish-Muslim relations and related fields, including the study of Israel and Palestine. So I want to conclude with some reflections about how this debate might illuminate some of the dominant themes many of us are grappling with in our own research. When I teach my course on Jewish-Muslim relations in the modern Middle East, one theme that keeps recurring is the contingent nature of identity in the late Ottoman era and the hardening of national categories by the 20th century, especially with the rise of Zionism and Arab nationalism. Think for a moment about the shifting categories of belonging in the late 19th century, the rich body of work on Ottoman and Arab Jews. For example, here I'm thinking of Lital Levi's work on the writer Esther Moyal, or Salim Tamari's description of Palestinian memoirists living in Jerusalem in the late 19th century. Many of us who teach or research in these areas work to unpack this multiplicity of belonging, where religious affiliation may not actually cohere with one's dominant choice of language or sense of communal affiliation. And it's natural to think in the late 19th century of religion and nationalism as distinct categories of analysis. As these questions become further entangled with the rise of Zionism and the emergence of Israel in 1948, as well as the concomitant Nakba, or dispossession catastrophe facing Palestinians at the time, the attainment of power and sovereignty for Jews in a national home brings with it the further entanglement of religion and nationalism. What the Jewish philosopher Yeshayahu Leibovitz argued was a nationalization of the Jewish religion. In the decades that have followed, these dynamics have often gotten conflated in ways that are now coming apart, as the arguments over anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism signify. And here in particular, I'm thinking of the last weeks of the Trump presidency and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's visit to the Psagot winery in the West Bank, where he talked about advocates of BDS being anti-Semitic and the State Department tweeting that anti-Zionism was anti-Semitism. The debate over the IHRA suggests a disentanglement that's happening around these questions, and that is getting worse and often stoked by advocates and by those who have abused the use of the definition. And I don't propose here that we have any easy answers. And I'm not also convinced that the creation of alternative definitions, one of which, the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, I was involved in drafting and launching, and I can talk more about, in and of itself, also is implicated somehow in the logic of definitions. We can talk more about that in the Q&A. But it is not a far jump from this kind of entanglement to witness the bounding up of Palestinian identity in discussions of anti-Semitism and the unhelpful ways in which debates over events in the Middle East begin to implicate Arab and Muslim subjects within these frames. And here I actually think we can think of really interesting parallels when we come to the work of historians like Ethan Katz and Maud Mandel, when we think about Jewish-Muslim relations in France and how they begin to map on to the dynamics of the Arab-Israeli conflict, or the anthropological work of Kimberly Arkin in her study of contemporary Jewry in France, and Omar Baum and his study of Jewish-Muslim relations in Morocco. All of these works, I think, show us the farther away we get from the actual interaction between Jews and Muslims and Jews and Arabs, the more suspicion and hardening of identity seems to grow. And as the logic of partition in Israel and Palestine loses its grip, and the status quo of a certain permanent condition of inequality and a deprivation of rights takes hold, the critiques that have surfaced around Israel and Zionism are increasingly portrayed within this frame of anti-Semitism. Now, aside from emptying anti-Semitism of its meaning, and here I'm not in any way sidelining the very real ways in which anti-Semitic speech can in fact be coded in anti-Zionist language, but to speak more broadly about the ways in which the introduction of the accusation of anti-Semitism can often serve to undermine the ability of Palestinian speech. This effort to introduce a prescriptive tool risks conflating legitimate critique with anti-Semitic animus. And this drives a wedge between communities, especially in university settings. So given our duty of care to students from multiple backgrounds, how would we ensure that discrimination is thought in a way that does not sacrifice one group's identity for another? We can't do this by deploying tools that are misused or that employ particularist aims, and yet these seem to be the ones so easily at our disposal. At UCL's Student Union meeting in January of 2019 to debate the IHRA, one representative of the Jewish Society expressed the view that, quote, Jewish students alone can define anti-Semitism. What happens when the choice of definition itself may also serve as a tool of exclusion? Listening to the targets of anti-Semitic and Islamophobic abuse, as well as sexist or racist, ageist, and ableist abuse and harassment is essential and necessary, but it cannot be the sole criterion for defining such abuse. It risks taking away any ground for minorities to show solidarity, and it can impinge on the rights of others, inviting a hierarchy of suffering that undermines shared struggles for equality. In the UK, one answer to this predicament is to better educate staff and students about the lived experience of discrimination, as well as particular histories that have affected Jews, Arabs, Muslims, and other minority groups. So too, a focus on understanding the Equality Act, definitions of harassment and discrimination, not only on the definition, but examples and testimony of victims. By offering Jewish and Muslim students and staff an opportunity to describe or talk about their own experiences of discrimination, we might move away from definitions alone toward an encounter with difference, opening the space where discomfort has too easily eclipsed mutual understanding. And so in this way, I want to return then to the vitrine and the material objects displayed as part of the moving objects exhibit I opened this talk with. Saif Abdeen, a law student at UCL, wrote of his wonder in coming into contact with this exhibit in his first year at university. As a Palestinian grandson of refugees, Abdeen writes, "My heart filled with appreciation. That moment was when I first felt home at UCL. But we met an organizer of the exhibit who mentioned that it's facing a smear campaign for allegedly being anti-Semitic. My heart fell. I asked why, and she pointed to one of the items in the exhibit, a traditionally embroidered map of historic Palestine with the Arabic names of Palestinian towns and cities, including one my family hails from. It reminded me of a similar embroidered map my grandparents, who themselves were refugees after being expelled by the Israeli government decades ago, had hanging in our kitchen back home. The allegation was that the map named the land Palestine, thereby erasing the existence of the state of Israel, which is allegedly anti-Semitic. If you can't even exhibit a refugee's traditional possession of a map showing their love for their homeland without facing a campaign of harassment, intimidation, Abdeen continued, then my mind wondered, what else could I not do? Was identifying as a Palestinian anti-Semitic? I mean, after all, identifying as Palestinian insinuates that I come from a land called Palestine. But if saying so erases Israel and is anti-Semitic, is my existence a hate crime? Looking back, Abdeen concludes, this might have subconsciously informed my decision to introduce myself as Jordanian whenever someone asked where I'm from, probably the most common question I got at UCL. While I had Jordanian citizenship and lived most of my life in Jordan, it was a lie. Where I truly felt I belonged was Palestine, the land of my ancestors and people. And he goes on to talk about the experience of the exhibit. And then to also talk in the conclusion about the Jewish community at UCL. There have been too many anti-Semitic incidents at UCL. In my opinion, one incident is too many. And I know that when a fellow Jewish student is attacked, they also think of their ancestors like I think of mine. It's necessary we tackle anti-Semitism head on and ensure all Jewish students and staff are safe, but we can never protect one community by making another feel unsafe. We can't protect Jewish students by leaving Palestinian students vulnerable. Saif's reflections are one place to start a discussion, and I'm sure we could find others, and we can also point to testimonials from Jewish students as well. The prevalence of these examples suggests to me that while definitions have their place, certainly as educational tools, and can help us distinguish difficult speech from discrimination, they're also meaningless without our ability to sustain other conversations as well across communal, political, and religious lines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seth. That was fascinating. I'm just going to enable the chat now so everyone can type their questions. Or just type in the chat if you want me to unmute you, and then you can ask your question by voice. Seth, could you let me know if you could see the chat just so I know it's been enabled?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. Seth, maybe I could open up the questions just to get the ball rolling. You mentioned at one point in your talk two scholars who had explored secularism and the legal mechanisms of the British state. Something about the categories of religion not fitting with Jewish or Muslim definitions. And yeah, I just wondered if you could expand a bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is just to briefly reiterate the work of Shai Lavi and Lina Salema, and Lina is Oxford and Shai Lavi at the Van Leer Institute. And the point that they both make is that the way in which Christian forms of legal thinking in Western states and how secularism itself is embedded in this kind of approach often excludes by definition the lived experience of religions that don't conform to a more privatized form of religion in the case of Christianity. And so part of what they're trying to do here is explain the ways in which Judaism and Islam actually in the legal realm of the secular state are unhelpfully placed in this separate category or positioned in a way that actually is quite counterproductive in thinking about Jews and Muslims.
Thank you. So we've got loads of questions here, so I'll just read out the first one. So this is from Emily White. Granted that you believe IHRA will chill criticism of Israel, the absence of a definition has a chilling effect of reporting and mitigating the instance and experience of anti-Semitism. Why do you recommend prioritizing the comfort of critics over the actual safety of a targeted minority?
So a good question, but I don't think it's a choice. I don't think it's one or the other. I mean, this is part of what I'm trying to suggest, that in some ways you can use educational tools that help us understand what anti-Semitism or what Islamophobia is or how it is transformed in the modern era. But when it's used as a prescriptive or legal tool that creates a wedge, it becomes unhelpful. So I don't think one can I don't think one has to exclude the possibility that definitions serve a function, but why this worship of one definition alone? Why is there only one particular way to think about this problem? If we learn anything about the history of anti-Semitism, it's that it's an entire, robust, diverse field that is constantly changing over time, given context and given new realities. And so the experience of anti-Semitism looks different in 2021 than it might in the 1970s or 1930s. And why would we then limit ourselves to one particular practitioner's definition? And so that to me speaks to a certain kind of symbolic politics that seems to be in play more than the actual prioritizing of experiences of targeted minorities. And as I also added to that, the definition itself doesn't do anything to address the institutional responsibility to actually ensure the safety of those minorities. So in some ways, the adoption of the definition becomes a distraction from that.
Thank you. And next question, Jacob Malky. What is the ratio between anti-Semitic and Islamophobic incidents in general and at the universities in particular?
I think that I don't have an answer to at hand, but some of at our own institution, part of that is that the surveys of both groups weren't completed fully, but in general, that that is a question that one should look to the database of practitioners. The problem being, I think, that the distinction about universities from the rest of wider society is that often these instances go unreported in university settings. So you wouldn't necessarily have a very reflective ratio or possibility of seeing those incidents in particular. That's what we found at our own institution, that despite the fact that you had instances being remarked upon in these surveys, they weren't reflected in the actual complaints procedure of the university. So there is a kind of lack of reliance of data reporting, which is part of the problem as well.
So the next question is Ralph Seliger. Doesn't it invite prejudice to reduce Israel to a vague ideology called Zionism? Isn't it natural for most Jews to see it highly threatening to advocate eliminating Israel, rather than reforming it to be more inclusive of its Arab minority?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question. I mean, I don't think I was reducing Israel to a vague ideology called Zionism. I think, you know, what we're trying to do in thinking about these questions is distinguish between the ways in which critiques of Zionism or Israel or statism can be distinguished from anti-Semitism. And I think one of the problems is a kind of conflation of all of these categories. So part of the effort in thinking a little bit about definitions themselves is how might you disentangle some of these categories from each other, and also the shifting nature, for example, of Zionism. That what do we mean by Zionism? What kinds of examples do we have historically of Zionism that isn't necessarily oriented towards a nation state? I mean, look at the work of Dima Shumsky, of Noam Pienko, others. There's a whole host of historical examples of commitments to Zionism that aren't necessarily identified with pursuit of national self-determination in the way we understand it today. So I think we also have to kind of historicize what exactly is Zionism, and whether or not critiques of Zionism are slipping into this category of eliminating or threatening to advocate eliminating Israel.
Thank you, Seth. So the next question we have is from Jacob Malky again. Is the expulsion of the Jews from Arab lands to be considered anti-Semitic?
It's a good question, and I think here we need to again go back to historical context and think about the very different cases we're talking about. When we talk about expulsions and the departure of Jews from Arab lands, we're not talking about one particular story, we're talking about many stories. So what happens with the Jews of Yemen is different than what happens with the Jews of Iraq and of Egypt. And one of the challenges for thinking about the role of the history of Jews from Arab lands, North Africa and the Middle East, is a kind of tendency to group these experiences together. Jews leave at different times for different reasons in different contexts, and some of those are motivated by incidents of anti-Semitism. We have, for example, in 1941, the Farhud in Iraq, which is a pogrom organized against the Jewish community of Baghdad, where we have examples in Lebanon and Syria of the Jewish community's number either remaining the same or growing after 1948. And in some instances, yes, we can consider anti-Semitism to play a role in the departure of Jewish communities. We can also think about how some of these migrations are connected to nationalism, are connected to regional realities of a shift from late Ottoman Empire to nation states. We can also think about the pull factors of why many Jews begin to depart Arab lands, having to do with pursuits of citizenship or of economic interests or educational opportunities outside of the region. So there's a whole host of things. What we can't do is kind of collapse it all into one big category.
I'm going to unmute Amina Bukhail now. She has a question. I've asked to unmute her, so I'll just see if that works. Seems she is still muted.
Okay, thank you very much.
There we go. Amina?
Good evening. For interesting presentation.
Yes. Amina, we can't hear you. Perhaps it would be best if you typed your question, if you can hear us. Okay, well, we currently have no more questions in the chat. Here we go, Susanna Heschel. Would say something about the role played by the IHRA, if any, in the several recent Israeli elections.
Thank you, Susanna, for the question. I think the kind of nice to see you. The broader question, I guess, is to think a little bit about the way in which the IHRA brings together academic scholars, practitioners, and states and governments. And so how, in this instance, do questions of adoption play a political role? That's how I would think a little bit about the role of the IHRA here, is that in emerging from a need to think about monitoring anti-Semitism in a European context, the organization very successfully, I think, has kind of transformed some of these questions about reporting incidents into a kind of political purchase of what adoption means or signifies by a given state. And so the question is, what does the adoption say about a state's commitment to protecting against Jews? So when Hungary adopts the IHRA, does it mean that Viktor Orban is himself not anti-Semitic? Does it mean that the state is in some ways devolving responsibility into the symbolic adoption? I mean, this is part of what I see as the trouble around definitions. And you could say it's a parallel to the trouble with the university. The adoption itself doesn't say anything about the content of beliefs or the way in which a state functions or treats its Jews or thinks about incidents of anti-Semitism. And so the tension, I think, that attends to this question of the political role of the organization is that it very much is a kind of actor or agent in a political conversation and scene. And as that political conversation in the last few years has become more febrile and more kind of committed to a promotion of particular politics around Israel and around Zionism, the dual kind of impulse to hold up an IHRA adoption with an actual failure to necessarily address incidents of anti-Semitism becomes a kind of political purchase card. And I think that risks the politicization of anti-Semitism as part of this broader landscape. And that's what I see as a very unhelpful way of thinking about it. Now, in the EU, for example, and in Europe, the way in which these adoptions and the kind of conversation around it has happened is often at the level of elites or people in the EU bureaucracy talking about the IHRA as the preeminent or gold standard definition, often not necessarily knowing much about these broader debates or complex histories of how anti-Semitism has been defined. And one of the interesting things to think about is how does the definition function in spaces where there's an absence or a smaller Jewish community in comparison, for example, to how it functions in larger spaces of Jewish communal life. So one of the things you see in the US, for example, even mainstream Jewish organizations like the ADL and the AJC have publicly talked about avoiding codification of the IHRA as a legal instrument. That kind of distinction does not exist in certain European contexts. So you won't hear that kind of internal diversity of opinion or dissent about the problems around codification as much, for example, in the UK. And I think that's another part of this issue, is the way in which this adoption reflects certain kinds of boundaries of communal belonging and a sense of, this becomes almost a lived civic identity, the way we hold on to or don't hold on to a particular definition of anti-Semitism.
Thank you for that. That was fascinating. So this is a question from Yael Aronoff. You seem to be saying that there should not be a single formal definition of anti-Semitism, much less have universities adopt a certain definition. On the other hand, you have signed on to another specific definition, the Jerusalem definition. Can you explain your thinking on this?
Yeah, I alluded to this in my talk, and how I think that very much embedded in the exercise of an alternative is a kind of epistemological problem. The minute you begin to kind of think about alternatives, you are legitimating the power of the definition to resolve the problem. And the reason for my involvement or signing of the Jerusalem Declaration stemmed from what I saw as a kind of stuck conversation, right? Certainly in the UK context, one's engagement on these questions, one's critique of the IHRA became a referendum on whether one cared or didn't care about Jews and anti-Semitism. And this was an absolutely false binary, right? To engage in any kind of examination or critique or thinking about whether or not this was an efficacious definition suddenly led to the accusation that you abet anti-Semitism because you don't accept it. Who ever heard of this? I mean, this has been around since 2016. And Jews and others have been writing and debating and engaging in questions of how we define questions of anti-Semitism for decades. And suddenly one's fealty to a particular kind of definition becomes a referendum on whether or not one is a good enough Jew. I mean, to me, that demanded a certain kind of response. And the response, one of the responses, and there are many ways you could approach this, is to say, well, let's think a little bit about how we might approach this question in a different way. If we were to bring together scholars of anti-Semitism studies, Holocaust studies, Israel-Palestine studies, could we try and come up with a more appropriate alternative, not for codification purposes, not for legal purposes, but actually to help us understand the actual complexities around contemporary forms of anti-Semitism. And more importantly, in this instance, because I think here the distinction of the Jerusalem Declaration is also to show what isn't anti-Semitic. And in the case of Israel-Palestine in particular, where political debate had become so toxic, to be able to disentangle some of these categories from one another in ways that would avoid the kinds of things you saw at the moving objects exhibit that I talked about. And so that's where you get, for example, the last 5 clauses of the Jerusalem Declaration, which talk about specific examples such as BDS or advocacy for rights-based approach to the Israel-Palestine question that are not in and of themselves anti-Semitic. I see it as an effort to help us think a little bit more clearly with a little bit more nuance. But I look at it like I look at the bookshelves that are behind many of you. They're reference guides. Just as if you were to talk to the FBI and you were to look at how they determine anti-Semitic hate crimes, they have binders full of definitions. They don't rely solely on one. So here, I don't think the use of a formal single definition is useful. I think we have to be able to use many different tools at our disposal rather than conform to one alone.
Thank you, Seth. So Amina, who couldn't speak earlier, typed a question privately to me. I'll just read that out. Have you used post-colonial theory in your approach? I mean,
to some extent, the questions that come about with the logic of comparison of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are very much shaped by the discourse of post-colonial studies, because the very kind of concept of putting these in conversation with one another, thinking about the different times and places in which anti-Semitism and Islamophobia arise, very much are shaped by literature from post-colonial studies. But as a historian, I would also say that they're shaped by the particularities of the historical context here. And that's why I mention specifically the work of Katz and Mandel on France, or others who I think are very much looking not only at the post-colonial, but at the colonial conditions that make for the experience of difference and exclusion, and that play out in particular ways. So, a lot of this is rooted in earlier historical examples that certainly come before the rise of the post-colonial moment.
Thank you for that. So this is more of a comment from Rebecca Vince. Just a quick note to say thanks, Seth. Would be interesting to consider the potential of differentiated solidarity by Michael Rothberg in combating various forms of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia alongside other forms of racism, notably highlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement and decolonizing the curriculum initiatives.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good point. It's also a part of, I think, some of the tensions that I see playing out at the university campus. Because if you get into the, the differentiated solidarity is the positive flip side of a definition Olympics. Because we could say that there are multiple ways that we could conjoin forces in thinking about how we fight prejudice and discrimination. This is why the Equalities Act in the UK is so powerful, because it includes so many different protected groups. But the minute we start thinking about individual group definitions, and every group tries to have a definition, that's when I think we break from this idea of differentiated solidarity. There we then begin to kind of obscure where should we be focusing our attention. So how do these conversations, for example, about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia maybe take up air or distract us from conversations about structural anti-Black racism? And this is something we contended with at UCL over the time of working on our report about the IHRA. As the Black Lives Matter protests spread in the UK and the US, there was a kind of question of why were we spending this time focused so heavily on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia as forms of racism and prejudice, and were we in some ways not also distracted from other forms of racism?
Thank you for that. So this is, again, more of a comment. Jonathan Rosenhead, breaking news. Today, the Open University, Britain's largest university, has just adopted the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism in preference for the IHRA definition. Respond to that if you wish, or I can move on to the next question.
I mean, it to some extent, it goes back to Yael's question about these ideas of definitions and what they are doing. Why are we in a position where we're having to debate within individual institutions one definition or another? Part of it is that we are stuck in a logic of definitions. And that's what I'm trying to suggest is something much broader about our expressions of political, communal, religious identity. And it's not necessarily a kind of, I don't think it's necessarily a positive thing to be in the space of having to fight over definitions, because it's actually distracting us from what I think is perhaps a more important task, is how do you facilitate cross-communal understanding? How do you actually eliminate these forms of prejudice as they're experienced?
So now we've got Bettina Friedrich question. Do you think the current discussion around the definition might polarize different groups at UK universities? Being on the UCL academic board, I have observed how passionate the discussion is at the moment, and what might be mid or long-term consequences. I think it is important that we are having these conversations, but I just feel it is worrying that some groups seem to drift apart.
Yeah, thank you, Bettina. I mean, this is something I've witnessed too. I think what we see happening, and I try to start here with the talk about the moving objects exhibit, I see a kind of recurrence of some of the toxic debates I saw in the early 2000s in the US, which very much polarized communities, right? The kind of introduction of these debates become a basis of creating a wedge issue between different groups. This is very much the case now in the UK. And part of it is because of the legacy of the political realities around the Labour Party and the fight over anti-Semitism there, right? None of what I'm talking about happens in a vacuum. All of this is part of a political conjuncture. So what's going on in the UK is very much tied to the politics around Labour and the bruising battles over anti-Semitism there. I think a lot of that has now mapped on to university life and is thoroughly unhelpful to the work that we do as educators in the classroom. But this is the reality, just like the reality in the early 2000s was shaped by the Second Intifada and the politics of what was happening in the Middle East, shaping the classroom, just like Maud Mandel would tell you that what's happening in Marseille in the mid-20th century is a function or a response to what's going on in Israel and Palestine. The point being that nothing is happening in a silo. And so what we're actually experiencing very much is a kind of connection with the outside and is a transnational story, right? The way in which these questions play out in the UK is going to be different than the US. It's very different than what happens in Germany or in Hungary. And so those particular contexts tell you something about the broader questions animating these discussions.
So I've asked to unmute, and there we go. Anthony has 2 questions.
Yes, hello, my name's Anthony. I'm a student at UCL. Thank you very much for the talk, and I do have 2 questions indeed. And more of the comments and questions at the end. So the first one is that I do agree in general that definitions of racism and in the definitions of individual racist actions do not address many aspects of discrimination, so chiefly institutional racism. However, in the case of anti-Semitism, I do feel that there is a need for more or less objective guidelines to distinguish anti-Semitic from anti-Zionist speech. And of course, this is needed not only to protect Jews from anti-Semitism, but also to enable Palestinians activists and critics of Israel to use the right to freedom of speech without being called anti-Semitic. And I feel that the case of anti-Semitism, therefore, may be somehow a special case. And I'd love to know what you think about that. And my second question concerns directly the IHRA definition. Because in my understanding and in my experience, the IHRA definition has, rather than used, has been largely misused. So a correct interpretation would actually solve many of the controversies that surround the definition, I believe. For instance, example 7 of the definition concerning the right to self-determination says that it is anti-Semitic to claim that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Instead, almost everybody in all the sources I've read, even the report of the UCL's academic board, actually uses the phrase existence of the state of Israel instead of a state of Israel as Israel. And I feel that there's a huge difference between the two, and that this would also have ramifications on the freedom of speech. So if much of the criticism of one definition was based on misinterpretation rather than interpretation, then the same can apply probably to virtually every other definition, including the Jerusalem definition. And that poses a problem, I believe. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. This was really 2 very good questions, Anthony. The first I want to say is about the question of needing guidelines, and there I agree with you. I don't for a moment think that it's a simple matter to distinguish between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, especially in this particular context that we're living in, and that's where there's value in educational tools that can help us do that. And the Jerusalem Declaration may be one, there are others. But the point that I'm trying to make is there's not a sole way of thinking about this, right? There's no uniform pedestal-ready definition that's the only way to think about this question. Historians have been debating Israel, Zionism, anti-Semitism for many, many years and have fierce arguments about it. So why would people line up behind one particular interpretation? That's the point to make. And so this is where you can use tools that exist. You can use new tools like the Jerusalem Declaration. You can use other tools. You can also do a forensic analysis of the IHRA and say, these parts I think are workable and these aren't. The problem, and this connects with your second question, is where the tool itself is also used incorrectly or misused or abused, and is not necessarily in the intent of the drafters, but in the actual take up by advocacy groups and political organizations and some advocates for these definitions. They become political instruments. And I think the misuse, whether or not we can say, well, this could be used correctly, we have to look at the reality that it isn't being used correctly. And if it were being used correctly, or if it were only a monitoring organization's way to report on particular incidents, it might serve a different purpose, but it has taken on a kind of political function or a quasi-legal status, as Rebecca Gould has argued. And that's the reality that we're living with. So there might be an ideal to say that this could be done in a way that weren't abused or that would be looked at differently. But in actual point of fact, we have too many instances now where it has not played out that way. Hence the desire or the need that has been voiced to dislodge or challenge it. Now, every potential definition can be misused. Every potential argument around these can be misused. I think part of the challenge here is to distinguish between these prescriptive or legal functions and how definitions illuminate or help us think. And that's the distinction I'm trying to argue for here. And in this case, you know, one of the reasons why we've landed up in this position is I think that practitioners and advocates for the IHRA probably went too far in taking what began as a monitoring instrument and making it into this gold standard, widely necessarily having to be embraced working definition that becomes invoked in difficult instances around anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. In that, I think there probably was a step too far. And so part of what's happening, I think, is a pushback against the overextension of one particular way of thinking about a problem.
Okay, I think we're quite close to the end now, so I think it's best that we wrap up. But I'd just like to say thank you so much, Seth. That was a fascinating talk and very important contentious issue that needs to be addressed. And thank you everyone for coming, for your questions. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event. And at the top of the chat, I posted the links to our upcoming events. So I will stop recording now. Okay, goodbye everyone, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.